The recycled air of Nexus Station's lower levels always smelled like burnt circuitry and desperation. Jake Morrison thought as he dragged his feet through the dimly lit corridor. Level 42 was about as low as anyone could get on the massive space station, and that was exactly where Jake found himself both literally and figuratively. The harsh buzz of his termination notice still rang in his enhanced hearing implant. The cargo supervisor hadn't even bothered to look him in the eye, just muttered something about efficiency protocols and scheduled maintenance delays. Jake knew it was garbage talk, for "we found someone cheaper the fifth time" had heard similar excuses this month. His stomach growled loud enough to make a passing Craxian merchant jump their tentacles, curling in surprise. Jake ignored them, focusing instead on the blinking credit display in his augmented vision. Read out 50 credits, remained a pathetic sum that represented everything he had left after pawning his mother's necklace, the last thing he had of her. The neon signs advertising various questionable entertainment venues cast shifting shadows across the metal grating beneath his feet, their garish colors reflecting off the condensation that perpetually dripped from the climate control units overhead. Jake had just decided to spend 5 credits on synthetic coffee when his implant picked up an unusual sound. The crystalline humming registered at a frequency most humans couldn't detect without enhancement. It reminded Jake of the time had dropped his mother's favorite glass ornament, the sound it made as it shattered on their colony home's concrete floor. But this sound was alive somehow, pulsing with a rhythm that made his chest ache. His feet moved before his brain could catch up, years of mandatory xenobiology training kicking in. As he turned down a narrow maintenance corridor, the sound grew stronger, accompanied by what his implant identified as subsonic distress frequencies. Following the noise, Jake pushed past hanging cables and forgotten repair drones until the corridor opened into a small alcove. The sight stopped him cold. Huddled against a coolant pipe was a young Zalaxian, her bioluminescent patterns flickering weakly across her crystalline skin structure. Jake had seen Zalaxians before, of course. They'd practically ran the high-finance sectors of every major station, but had never seen one in the lower levels, and certainly never one in such obvious distress. His implant automatically began translating her light patterns, the readout in his vision showing critical warnings: system failure imminent, severe nutrient deficiency, cellular degradation, approaching critical threshold. The Zalaxian girl couldn't have been more than an adolescent by their standards, a core light signature still showing the pale blue tint of youth. As Jake stood frozen in indecision, his implant registered 2 more Zalaxian signatures. Approaching, his heart leaped, thinking help had arrived. But the newcomers were merchants, their expensive environment suits gleaming even in the dim light. They paused at the entrance to the alcove, their own patterns showing clear recognition of the girl's condition. Instead of helping, they hurried past. Their whispered conversation carried to Jake through his implant lower caste problems. Best not to get involved could be a scam. Their lights dimmed to nearly nothing as they rushed away, leaving the girl alone again. The credit counter blinked in Jake's vision, mocking him with its meager sum. 50 credits was even enough for a decent meal in the upper levels, but down here it could buy enough nutrient paste to keep someone alive for a week, maybe more. His own stomach cramped, reminding him that he hadn't eaten anything but synthetic protein cubes in days. The girl's light patterns flickered again, weaker this time, and Jake saw his own reflection in a piece of broken machinery. Nearby, he looked exactly like all those people who had walked past him when he was living rough on Mars Colony after his mother died, times when a single act of kindness could have made all the difference. His hand moved to his pocket, where the credit chip felt heavy against his thigh. Jake Morrison might have hit rock bottom, but he remembered something his mother used to say: the view from the bottom lets you see what really matters. Closing his eyes for a moment, he made his decision. The credit chip burned in Jake's palm as he watched the Zalaxian girl's bioluminescent patterns fade to dangerous levels, his enhanced vision overlay translating the pulses into increasingly dire warnings. Critical systems failing, immediate intervention, required cellular breakdown imminent. The clinical readout somehow made it worse, more real. 50 credits, 50 measly credits that he got from watching the pawnshop owner carelessly toss his mother's necklace into a drawer like it was just another piece of space junk. Jake could still remember her wearing it during their last video call. From the Mars Colony Hospital, her smile brave, even as the radiation sickness made her hands shake too much to hold the pendant. A group of station residents hurried past, their footsteps echoing on the metal grating. Some glanced at the dying alien girl, but most kept their eyes fixed ahead the same way they probably looked away from the homeless humans in their own neighborhoods. Jake recognized that deliberate blindness had perfected it himself during his first months on the station, when his own credits were too few to help everyone who needed it. His implant chirped a helpful suggestion based on his vital signs, telling him he needed to consume nutrients within the next 6 hours to maintain optimal function. Jake laughed bitterly at that he already knew exactly how long he could go without food. Thanks to plenty of practical experience, his current record was 4 days before the shakes got too bad to work the cargo loaders. The girl shifted slightly, her crystalline skin structure catching the dim light of a flickering advertisement nearby, creating a prismatic effect that reminded Jake of the sunsets back on Earth, the ones his mother used to paint before they left for the colonies. Her light patterns changed, forming complex geometries that his implant struggled to translate, but the meaning was clear. She was afraid. Jake accessed the station's public network through his basic neural link, searching for information about Zalaxian physiology. The results made his heart sink. Premium-grade nutrient paste, specifically formulated for crystalline-based life forms, cost 47 credits. Per standard unit, anything less pure could cause catastrophic system failure in their delicate biological matrices that would leave him with 3 credits, not even enough for a cup of synthetic coffee. A maintenance drone whirred past, its sensors briefly illuminating the alcove in harsh white light. Jake caught sight of his reflection in a burnished panel nearby. He looked haunted, dark circles under his eyes closed, hanging loose after weeks of barely eating. The image of his mother rose unbidden in his mind, her voice clear as station chatter. Sometimes the only way up is to lift someone else first. His implant registered another change in the girl's light patterns. They were becoming erratic now, the equivalent of a human heartbeat going into arrhythmia. According to his xenobiology training, read out the overlay in his vision estimated complete system failure within 20 minutes without intervention. Jake had seen that countdown before on his mother's hospital monitors, watching the numbers tick down, knowing there was nothing he could do. More station residents passed by, a Craxian merchant, a human family in mid-level clothing, 2 more Zalaxians in expensive environmental suits, their own patterns showing clear recognition of a dying member of their species. But still they walked past. Jake felt something shift inside him, a quiet rage at their indifference, or maybe at himself, for all the times had been just like them. The credit chip in his hand displayed its balance one last time, the numbers floating in his vision like an accusation. 50 credits that could keep him fed for a week, or save 1 life right now. His mother would have known what to do. She always did, even at the end, when the credits had run out and the hospitals wouldn't take colony script. She had found ways to help others in the ward. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the weight of his mother's necklace, the way it felt when she pressed it into his hands, making him promise to keep helping others the way she had taught him. He opened his eyes, watching the girl's light patterns grow dimmer by the second, and made the only choice he could live with. The premium nutrient paste glowed an unsettling shade of blue in its transparent container. Jake tried not to think about how the shopkeeper had smirked when he handed over 47 credits, leaving him with enough for maybe half a protein cube. His enhanced hearing picked up the merchant's muttered comment about humans and their bleeding hearts, but he focused instead on the way the Zalaxian girl's light patterns had already begun to stabilize. She sat propped against the wall of the maintenance corridor, her crystalline skin structure slowly regaining its natural luminescence. Jake watched the readouts from his implant as her vital signs climbed back into safer ranges. The technical data scrolling past his vision helped distract him from the growing emptiness in his stomach. "My designation is Lyra," the girl suddenly transmitted in complex patterns of light that his implant translated with only minor difficulty. Her movements were becoming more fluid as the nutrient paste did its work, though she still seemed to be conserving energy. Jake noticed she used a formal dialect of light speech, one his basic xenobiology training hadn't covered completely. Jake Morrison, he responded automatically, then remembered she probably couldn't understand him without a translator, but to his surprise, she nodded in a distinctly human gesture. "Your audio language is familiar to me." She transmitted, "The light patterns forming faster now. My translator was damaged, but I retain understanding of human speech patterns." The maintenance corridor hummed with the constant background noise of the station's systems. Jake glanced nervously at the passing shadows, keeping watch for station security. Being in this section without authorization could get them both fined or worse. But Lyra needed time to recover enough to move safely. "What happened to your translator?" he asked, trying to keep his voice low. Lyra's patterns dimmed slightly, showing what his implant identified as emotional distress sabotage. She transmitted, after a moment of hesitation, the patterns becoming more complex. "My identification chip was also taken, leaving me unable to access my accounts or contact my..." She paused, her lights flickering in what seemed like uncertainty. "My family." Jake frowned at that. Selections were usually heavily protected, especially the younger ones. The idea of one being stranded in the lower levels without access to their resources was more than suspicious, but the genuine distress in her light patterns made him hesitate to question her story too closely. His own experience with poverty had taught him sometimes the truth was complicated. "The cargo bay," he said, finally making a decision that would probably get him arrested if anyone found out. "It's warm, and the security sensors are broken in Section 7. We can use the loader terminal to send messages through the maintenance network." His implant helpfully highlighted all the regulations he was about to break, but Jake ignored the warnings. Lyra's patterns shifted to show surprise, then something his translator couldn't quite pass, but seemed close to gratitude. Jake helped her stand, noting how she moved with a grace that seemed at odds with her apparent condition. Together, they made their way through the back corridors, Jake using his workers' access codes to bypass the minimal security. The cargo bay was deserted this late in the station's cycle. The massive space, filled with containers and the gentle hum of antigrav units. Jake led Lyra to his usual workspace, where a battered terminal still displayed his logins from his last shift. Before being fired, he positioned her near one of the heating vents, where the warmth from the engines below helped maintain the delicate temperature balance Selections needed. While Lyra worked at the terminal attempting to establish communications, Jake shared his emergency rations, 2 synthetic protein cubes that tasted like recycled plastics. Watching her intricate light patterns, he noticed something odd about the way she interfaced with the computer. Her movements suggested far more familiarity with human technology than any ordinary Zalaxian should have, particularly one who claimed to be from a merchant family. His implant caught fragments of what seemed like encrypted data packets whenever she transmitted, but before he could focus on them, Lyra began teaching him the more intricate aspects of Zalaxian light speech, her knowledge surprisingly extensive for someone her apparent age and status. Jake found himself fascinated, despite his growing suspicions, learning patterns and meanings that went far beyond his basic training. Jake began noticing the inconsistencies during their third meeting in the cargo bay, his enhanced hearing picking up whispered conversations in the shadows that went silent the moment he turned his head. The security cameras would shift slightly, tracking their movements, despite being officially deactivated, according to the maintenance logs he accessed. Lyra sat perched on a cargo container, her crystalline form casting prismatic patterns across the bay as she taught him increasingly complex forms of light speech, her knowledge far too sophisticated for the merchant caste she claimed to belong to. Jake had worked enough loading jobs to know that most Solaxian merchants barely bothered learning basic human expressions, let alone teaching their children the intricacies of formal light dialectics. His stomach growled loudly, interrupting her explanation of a particularly complex greeting pattern. Jake tried to hide his discomfort, but his implant helpfully displayed his deteriorating nutritional status in his vision overlay. Critical protein deficiency detected, immediate supplementation required. He dismissed the warning with a thought he'd gone hungry before he could do it again. "Your physical form requires sustenance," Laura transmitted her patterns, showing concern, but Jake noticed how the message carried subtle harmonics that his implant flagged as unusual for her supposed social status, the kind of refined light speech patterns that normally came from much higher castes than simple merchants. "Just need to finish this shift," Jake lied, knowing he had no shift to finish since being fired, but the cargo bay had become their regular meeting place, and he didn't want her to worry his implant caught another shadow moving too precisely in his peripheral vision. Definitely not a maintenance drone this time. The movement reminded him of military training. A sudden burst of encrypted communications flashed between hidden points in the cargo bay, his implant registering the signals, but unable to decode them. Lara seemed not to notice, but Jake saw how her own light patterns briefly synchronized with the encrypted bursts. Before shifting back to their conversation, he pretended not to notice, choosing instead to ask about Salaxian customs. Strange things began happening at the station more frequently now. Jake's old cargo loader would malfunction, nearly crushing him, until he jumped clear at the last-second. Security doors would seal randomly, forcing him to take different routes through the station. Maintenance systems would glitch whenever he passed, showing him glimpses of classified ship movements in supposedly broken displays. His credit account drew his attention one morning, flashing an alert that made him freeze momentarily. 50,000 credits appeared in his balance, the kind of money that could change his life, buy him passage off station, set him up somewhere better. But before he could access it, the credits vanished, leaving only an error message, his account showing no record of the transaction. Laura continued her lessons, each meeting revealing more about Salaxian culture than Jake had learned in years of working the docks. Her stories grew more detailed, touching on aspects of high society that someone of her claimed status should never have witnessed. Jake caught her several times using terms and references that his implant identified as restricted knowledge, classified above his clearance level. Station security started asking questions about his activities, pulling him aside for random scans that seemed focused on his neural implant rather than contraband. Their questions, oddly specific about his interactions with Salaxians. Jake noticed how they always seemed to lose interest, suddenly their eyes going distant as if receiving new orders through their neural links before letting him go. The shadows that followed them grew bolder. Jake spotted reflection patterns that matched Salaxian military-grade stealth suits, the kind of technology that cost more than he would earn in 10 lifetimes. His implant occasionally picked up fragments of tactical communications using encryption protocols far beyond standard merchant security. Something bigger was happening here, Jake realized watching Lyra demonstrate a particularly complex light pattern that his implant identified as being traditionally reserved for royal ceremonies. She caught him studying her too intently and quickly shifted to simpler patterns. But the slip had been made. Jake remembered his mother's warning about games played in the upper levels of society and wondered exactly what kind of game he had stumbled into. The cargo loader screamed in protest as its magnetic clamps released without warnings, sending a container of valuable Centaurian silk plummeting toward Jake, his enhanced reflexes barely letting him roll clear as 10 tons of cargo crashed into the deck where he had stood seconds before his implant blared warnings about the completely impossible failure of 7 different safety systems. That was the second near miss this week, Jake thought, picking himself up from the cold deck plates, his body aching from the desperate dive. The first incident had involved a sudden gravity failure in a maintenance shaft that would have dropped him 40 levels if he hadn't grabbed a support beam. His fingers still bore the bruises from that close call. His implant pinged, alerting him to another encrypted burst of communication from the shadows that constantly lurked at the edge of his vision. The mysterious watchers had grown careless, or perhaps no longer cared. If he noticed them, Jake counted at least 6 different positions, where the light bent oddly in ways that suggested active camouflage technology. Laura hadn't visited in 3 days, her absence gnawing at him more than the constant hunger that had become his companion. Since spending his last credits on her nutrient paste, Jake caught glimpses of her sometimes in the upper levels of the station, arguing in complex light patterns with hidden figures, her own patterns showing stress, and what his implant translated as royal command patterns before she noticed him and vanished into the crowd. His credit account continued its strange behavior, massive sums appearing and disappearing. Before he could access them, his neural link picking up fragments of high-level financial algorithms, trying to process the transactions. Jake recognized the digital fingerprints of aristocratic banking houses, the kind of institutions that normally wouldn't even acknowledge the existence of someone from the lower levels. Station security increased their presence around his usual routes, their questions becoming more pointed about his relationship with Lyra and his knowledge of Zalaxian's social structures. Jake noticed how their neural implants all seemed to receive synchronized updates whenever he mentioned her name, their attitudes shifting from aggressive interrogation to complete disinterest in seconds. The maintenance corridors felt different, now filled with an electric tension that made his enhanced hearing pick up phantom sounds. Jake found himself analyzing every shadow, calculating escape routes. Whenever he entered a new section, his mother's military training finally proving useful in ways he had never expected to need on a civilian station. A group of Zalaxian merchants cornered him near the recycling processors, their light patterns hostile as they demanded information about the girl he had helped. Jake noticed their supposedly simple trading clothes contained hidden technology, his implant identifying military-grade defensive systems and banned weaponry, before they too received some silent command and retreated. His own quarters no longer felt safe. Jake discovered surveillance devices hidden in the environmental controls, their technology far beyond standard station security equipment. His implant couldn't even categorize some of the components. When he tried to scan them, the devices disappeared within hours, replaced by new ones in different locations. The breaking point came when Jake spotted Lyra in a forgotten cargo bay, her light patterns engaged in what his implant identified as a heated argument with several cloaked figures, their stealth technology failing to completely hide the Royal Guard insignias on their environmental suits. Jake watched from behind a container as Lyra transmitted patterns that contained unmistakable elements of royal authority. Something was very wrong here, Jake realized as he observed the confrontation, his implants struggling to translate the highest levels of formal light speech patterns that flashed between Lyra and her hidden guardians. The girl he had helped with his last credits was obviously far more than a simple merchant caste member. But before he could process this revelation, his implant screamed a warning, detecting multiple weapons powering up around him. Jake barely had time to register the cargo loader's warning klaxon before the massive machine spun out of control, its robotic arms sweeping across the bay directly toward where Lyra stood arguing with her hidden guardians. His body moved before his mind could process the danger, enhanced reflexes propelling him across the deck plates. Warning shots from precision energy weapons scorched the metal around his feet as he ran the supposedly deactivated security systems, suddenly blazing to life with lethal intent. Jake noticed how the shots seemed carefully placed, not truly meant to hit him, but to hedge him toward a specific path, his implant highlighting the pattern even as he dove toward Lyra. "Get down," Jake shouted, forgetting in the chaos that she could only understand his light patterns. But Lyra was already moving with a grace that revealed years of combat training, her crystalline form flowing like liquid light as she evaded both the cargo loader and the weapons fire. Her movements, nothing like the helpless girl he had first encountered in the lower levels. Multiple stealth fields deactivated around them, revealing squads of Zalaxian royal guards, their environmental suits bearing the highest house markings. Jake had ever seen, their weapons trained not on him, but on the shadows that now emerged from behind cargo containers, revealing figures in unmarked combat suits, his implant identifying both groups as elite military units. "Jake Morrison, stand down," a voice commanded in perfect standard, the words accompanied by formal light speech patterns that made his basic implant translator crash and reboot. The speaker stepped forward wearing the distinctive crystalline armor of a Zalaxian royal protector. "This situation is beyond your comprehension." The cargo loader continued its deadly dance, sparks flying as its malfunctioning arms tore through support structures. Jake realized with horror that the entire bay was being systematically destroyed, a calculated attack meant to look like an industrial accident. His enhanced hearing picked up the sound of emergency bulkheads engaging, sealing them inside. Lyra moved to stand between Jake and the royal protector, her light patterns shifting into something so complex and authoritative that the guards immediately dropped to defensive positions around her. "This human is under my protection," she transmitted in patterns that made the air itself seem to vibrate with power. "I am Princess Lyralith, heir to the 7th crystal throne, and I command you to stand down." The revelation hit Jake like a gravity shift. Princess Lyralith, the most protected being in Zalaxian space, the subject of 1,000 rumors and speculation about why she had vanished from the imperial court. 3 months ago, his mind raced back to every interaction, every lesson in light speech, every seemingly casual question about human culture and station life. Multiple explosions rocked the cargo bay, sending containers tumbling through the failing gravity field. Jake grabbed Lyra, pulling her clear of a falling support beam, acting on instinct rather than protocol. His action causing the royal guards to surge forward, weapons raised, but Lyra stopped them with a single light pattern. "We are under attack," she transmitted as more explosions echoed through the station, the unmarked combat suits moving with deadly purpose through the chaos, their weapons now clearly targeting the princess separatist forces. Jake realized, remembering news reports about a faction within the Zalaxian Empire that opposed any cooperation with other species. The royal protector barked orders in light speech too complex for Jake's implant to translate, but the situation was clear. They were trapped in a killing zone with hostile forces between them and any escape route, the cargo bay's structural integrity failing around them as more explosions breached the outer walls. Jake felt a strange calm settle over him as he assessed their situation, his mother's military training combining with years of working the station's maintenance systems, his mind already mapping possible escape routes through the secondary maintenance tunnels that even the royal guards might not know about. He looked at Lyra, Princess Lyralith, who had risked everything to understand his species, who had chosen to reveal her true identity to save him. "I know a way out," he said, switching to the formal light patterns she had taught him. "But we have to move now." More explosions rocked the bay as the separatists pressed their attack, forcing them all to take cover behind fallen cargo containers. Jake watched the royal protector evaluate him with enhanced sensors before nodding grimly in acceptance as the situation deteriorated around them. The news spread through Nexus Station like a plasma fire, burning through every level from the pristine upper decks to the grimiest maintenance shafts. Security footage of a human risking his life to save the Zalaxian princess played on every HFY screen, the station's AI systems struggling to contain the viral spread of images showing Jake Morrison, a lowly cargo worker, choosing to help what he thought was a homeless alien girl. In the station's medical bay, Jake watched the chaos unfold through his neural implant display, his body still recovering from the desperate escape through the maintenance tunnels. Station residents of every species gathered in communal areas, watching and rewatching the footage of him sharing his last credits with a disguised princess, their discussions ranging from incredulous to inspired. Lyra, or Princess Lyralith, as she was now officially known, had been moved to the secure diplomatic sector, but her light patterns still reached him through the station's communications network, transmitting messages in the complex language she had taught him, her patterns carrying both royal authority and personal warmth that made the medical staff nervous every time that instruments registered the communications. The Zalaxian Empire had always maintained strict protocols about interaction with other species, particularly humans who they viewed as unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Jake learned that Lyra's experiment had been conducted in secret against the direct wishes of the Imperial Council. Her decision to live among the station's lower levels, designed to test her people's prejudices about other species. Footage from Lyra's hidden guards reveal how dozens of wealthy Zalaxians had ignored her deliberate distress signals, while Jake, who had nothing, chose to help. Their reactions to this revelation caused unprecedented turmoil in the Empire's rigid social hierarchy, the concept that a human would sacrifice his own well-being for a stranger challenging centuries of established beliefs about humanity. Station security found themselves overwhelmed as Zalaxian nobles began descending to the lower levels, some for the first time in their lives asking questions about human culture and society that they had never bothered to consider before. Jake's simple act of kindness had cracked something in their crystalline worldview, letting new light shine through. His neural implant continuously received messages from across known space reporters, seeking interviews, sociologists requesting studies, and most surprisingly Zalaxian nobles asking for guidance on understanding human behavior. Jake noticed how the station residents who had previously ignored him now stopped to transmit greeting patterns, some awkwardly attempting the light speech he had learned from Lyra. The separatists who had attacked them in the cargo bay had inadvertently revealed themselves to be members of high-ranking noble houses. Their captured communications, showing a desperate attempt to prevent closer relations between humans and Zalaxians. Jake learned that his actions had unwittingly disrupted their entire political strategy, which had relied on maintaining distrust between the species. In the lower levels, where Jake had first found Lyra, something remarkable began to happen. Zalaxian merchant houses started establishing cultural exchange centers, offering free language lessons and basic necessities to any species in need. The same merchants who had walked past their dying princess now fought to prove they had learned from her experiment. His mother would have loved this, Jake thought, watching through the medical bay's observation window as a young Zalaxian noble awkwardly attempted to help a human child with a malfunctioning environment, suit the noble's light patterns showing genuine concern rather than the usual condescension that had marked such interactions before. The station itself seemed different now, the rigid boundaries between levels and species beginning to blur as Lyra's story inspired others to reach across traditional divisions. Jake received word that similar changes were spreading to other stations across Zalaxian space, his simple decision to help someone in need creating ripples that threatened to reshape centuries of galactic society. Even as he recovered, Jake could feel the weight of change in the air, his enhanced hearing picking up conversations in multiple languages about breaking down barriers and challenging assumptions. The footage of his actions continuing to spread, carrying with it a simple but powerful message that compassion transcended species and status. The Imperial Zalaxian fleet dropped out of hyperspace in a display of crystalline beauty that made Nexus Station's sensors temporarily overload their massive ships, catching the light of the nearby star and refracting it in patterns that his implant identified as ancient declarations of royal presence. Jake watched from the medical bay as the station's eyes struggled to process the sheer amount of protocol violations occurring as the Emperor himself broke centuries of tradition by coming to a human-controlled station. Apparently saving a princess from separatist assassins while suffering from malnutrition was enough to get anyone's attention, even that of the most powerful being in Zalaxian space. Jake thought as his implant registered the approaching diplomatic party, their light patterns so complex and layered with meaning that the translation software crashed 3 times trying to process them. The Emperor moved through the station like living light, his crystalline form emanating patterns of such intricate authority that other Zalaxians literally froze in place, their own patterns dimming in automatic submission. Jake noticed how the royal guards seemed almost nervous as they approached the medical bay, their formation shifting to account for the unprecedented situation of their Emperor visiting a human. "Your Radiance," the medical staff transmitted in clumsy light speech patterns, clearly rehearsed for this moment. The human Jake Morrison is still recovering from acute malnutrition and neural strain, but their careful medical report was cut short by a single pattern from the Emperor that made every Zalaxian in the room step back in shock. The Emperor approached Jake's bed alone, his guards practically vibrating with suppressed protest as their sovereign broke another 1,000 years of protocol. Jake tried to sit up, but a pattern from the Emperor kept him in place, the translation coming through his implant with crystal clarity. "Rest, young human, you have done more than enough." Jake watched in amazement as the Emperor of the Zalaxian Empire pulled a simple chair beside his bed and sat down as if they were equals in the lower levels, his guards looking like they might shatter from the stress of seeing their ruler behave so casually. "My daughter tells me you spent your last credits to save her life when you thought she was nothing more than a homeless girl." The words came in both light speech and standard language, the patterns so precisely formed that Jake's basic implant had no trouble translating them. She says you broke station regulations to keep us safe, taught her about human culture, and risked your life to protect her when the separatists attacked, all without knowing her true identity. Memories flashed through Jake's mind, the sight of Lyra huddled in that maintenance corridor, the taste of his last protein cube, the warmth of the cargo bay. As he taught her human expressions, the chaos of their escape through maintenance tunnels, it hadn't seemed like choices at the time, just the right thing to do. The Emperor studied him with sensors that Jake knew could detect the slightest deception. Your actions have caused quite a stir in the Empire. Young humans, centuries of beliefs about your species being challenged by a single act of kindness. The light patterns accompanying his words carried layers of meaning that hinted at massive changes already occurring in Zalaxian society. Station security reported that 17 Zalaxian noble houses had already established permanent diplomatic missions in the lower levels, their representatives learning human customs and offering assistance to those in need. The Emperor seemed almost amused by this development. Your example has inspired quite a revolution in our thinking. The medical bay had become crowded with officials from both human and Zalaxian space, their presence drawing more attention to the unprecedented meeting taking place. Jake could hear his implant picking up thousands of conversations throughout the station as news of the Emperor's visit spread, many discussing the symbolic importance of the most powerful Zalaxian choosing to sit beside a human cargo worker. What happens now? Jake asked, switching to formal light speech patterns out of respect, though he noticed the Emperor seemed pleased by his use of casual standard language as well. The answer came in a complex series of patterns that made the air itself seem to shimmer with possibility. Now, young human, we begin to rebuild everything we thought we knew about each other. One standard year after Jake Morrison spent his last credits on Zalaxian nutrient paste, he stood in the gleaming crystal hall of the Imperial Palace, his neural implant now upgraded with full diplomatic protocols, tracking the hundreds of light conversations happening around him, the integration of human and Zalaxian culture visible in every corner of the vast space. The Interspecies Assistance Initiative had spread far beyond Nexus Station, becoming a cornerstone of human-Zalaxian relations. Jake watched as another group of noble houses pledged their resources to the program, their light patterns showing genuine enthusiasm rather than mere political maneuvering. His enhanced implant, detecting the subtle harmonics that indicated true commitment to change. Princess Lorelith moved through the crowd, her crystalline form now familiar to humans across known space. As she continued her work, breaking down barriers between species, Jake smiled, remembering the frightened girl he had found in a maintenance corridor who had turned out to be the catalyst for a cultural revolution, her carefully planned experiment yielding results far beyond even her expectations. The former separatists who had attacked them in the cargo bay now served as advocates for integration, their own prejudices shattered by the evidence of humanity's capacity for selfless action. Jake had learned that his simple choice to help someone in need had accomplished what centuries of diplomatic negotiations had failed to achieve, showing both species their shared capacity for compassion. Your mother would be proud. A familiar light pattern reached him. Jake turned to find the Emperor approaching his guards, now comfortable with their sovereign's habit of casual conversation with the human who had helped change their society. The pattern carried harmonics of both formal recognition and personal warmth that have helped create something unprecedented. Jake thought of his mother's necklace still sitting in that pawnshop on Nexus Station. Though now he could easily afford to buy it back, he had chosen to leave it there, asking the owner to give it to the next person who needed to sell something precious, the small act creating its own ripple of change through the station's lower levels. The initiative had transformed the lower levels of every major station in human and Zalaxian space, creating zones where species could meet as equals, share resources, and learn from each other. Jake watched as a group of Zalaxian youth demonstrated light speech to human children while their parents exchanged stories nearby, the rigid social barriers of the past crumbling in the face of genuine connection. His enhanced hearing picked up fragments of conversation in multiple languages as diplomatic teams discussed expanding the initiative to other species as success of humans relaxed in cooperation, becoming a model for greater integration throughout known space. Jake had never imagined that sharing his last credits would lead to such profound changes. The Imperial Palace itself had been modified to accommodate human visitors' environmental systems, adjusted to support both species comfortably. Jake noticed how the crystalline architecture now incorporated human design elements, the blending of styles reflecting the larger integration happening between their cultures, his own quarters in the diplomatic wing, symbolizing the new balance they had achieved. Princess Lorolith approached, joining her father and Jake, her light patterns carrying the warm familiarity of their shared secret time in the cargo bay, when she was simply Lyra, and he was simply a kind human who chose to help. The universe has strange ways of creating change. She transmitted her patterns containing layers of meaning that only Jake, with his unique experience, could fully understand. Jake thought of all the small choices that had led to this moment: the decision to spend his last credits, the broken regulations, the desperate escape through maintenance tunnels, each seemingly insignificant action connecting to create something larger than himself. His mother's words echoing in his memory: sometimes the only way up is to lift someone else first. The great crystal hall filled with a combined light of human and Zalaxian celebration, their different ways of expressing joy merging into something new and beautiful. Jake Morrison, former cargo worker, now first human cultural ambassador to the Zalaxian Empire, stood among them, knowing that the greatest changes often began with the smallest choices, and that compassion spoke in a language all species could understand.